suffocating grip. Across the Atlantic, a king sits on a throne of gold, viewing an entire continent as nothing more than a private ledger. To speak of freedom is to flirt with the gallows. But in the sweltering heat of a July morning in Philadelphia, a group of traitors is gathered in a room where the air is thick with the scent of ink and anxiety. They aren't just signing a document, they are signing their own execution orders. And high above them, in a dusty wooden steeple, hangs a massive, silent witness. It is a bell that was never meant to be a symbol of war, but today it is about to scream. This is the moment the heartbeat of a nation began, not with a whisper, but with a roar of metal that would change the world forever. The year was 1776, but the spirit of rebellion had been simmering for over a decade. Philadelphia was the crown jewel of the American colonies, a bustling port city of cobblestones and commerce. Yet a heavy shroud hung over the city. British warships loomed in the harbors like gray predators, their cannons pointed toward the very people they were sworn to protect. At the heart of the city stood the Pennsylvania State House. Inside, the atmosphere was claustrophobic. The windows were shut tight to keep out eavesdroppers, despite the stifling summer humidity. This was the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. These men, farmers, lawyers, doctors, and merchants, were not the polished statues we see in museums today. They were exhausted, terrified, and deeply divided. John Adams paced the floor, his voice rasping from weeks of debate. He knew that half the room was still paralyzed by the fear of King George III's retribution. To rebel against the British Empire, the most powerful military force on the face of the earth, wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. "We are in the midst of a revolution," Adams would shout, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, "the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations." But the opposition was fierce. Men like John Dickinson argued for reconciliation, fearing that a break from England would lead to a bloody chaos that would burn the colonies to ash. Outside, the common people waited. The blacksmiths, the seamstresses, and the tavern keepers gathered in small knots on the street corners. They spoke in low tones about the Declaration being drafted by a tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. High above this tension, in the belfry of the State House, sat the bell. Cast in London years prior, it bore a prophetic inscription from the book of Leviticus: "Proclaim liberty through all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." For years it had rung for fires, for the king's birthdays, and for the opening of courts. It was a tool of the establishment. But on this day, the bell ringer, an old man with weathered hands, sat by the rope. He had been told to wait. He was waiting for a signal from a young boy stationed at the doors below. The boy was the link between the secret deliberations of the elites and the iron voice of the tower. As the sun reached its zenith, the debate inside the hall reached a breaking point. The parchment was ready, the ink was wet, the names were being called. Every stroke of the pen was a hammer to the old world order. The silence in the square grew deafening. The city held its breath, caught between the safety of tyranny and the lethal gamble of freedom. The old man in the steeple gripped the hemp rope. His palms were sweaty. He looked out over the rooftops of Philadelphia, toward the horizon where the British might already be marching. He knew that once he pulled that rope, there was no going back. The sound would not just reach the ears of the citizens, it would echo across the Atlantic, a direct challenge to the throne. Then the door below creaked open. The boy turned, his face pale but his eyes alight. He looked up toward the shadows of the steeple and screamed at the top of his lungs. The boy's voice sliced through the humid air of the courtyard like a lightning bolt, shattering the heavy silence that had gripped Philadelphia for hours. Up in the belfry, the old bell ringer, Andrew McNair, didn't hesitate. He threw the full weight of his body into the hemp rope. At first, there was only the groan of seasoned timber and the protest of rusted iron hinges. Then the massive bronze tongue swung, striking the side of the bell with a force that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the State House. Clang! The first note was a shock to the system. It wasn't the rhythmic, polite tolling for a Sunday service or the frantic, even peal of a fire alarm. This was something different. It was deep, resonant, and carried a weight that felt elemental. As the bells swung back and forth, the sound began to cascade over the rooftops of the city, rolling down toward the Delaware River and echoing through the narrow alleys where people stood frozen in their tracks. In the assembly room below, the delegates heard it. For Thomas Jefferson, the sound was the final punctuation mark on the document he had labored over for weeks. For Benjamin Franklin, it was the chime of a new era of enlightenment. But for many others, that sound felt like the closing of a coffin lid on their old lives. There was no longer room for maybe or perhaps. The bell was proclaiming a fact that could not be unsaid. The United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The streets, which had been eerily quiet moments before, suddenly erupted. It started as a low murmur near the State House gates and grew to a roar that rivaled the bell itself. People poured out of taverns, shops, and homes. The mechanics, the backbone of Philadelphia's working class, dropped their tools and ran toward the square. Blacksmiths left their forges glowing hot. Bakers left their ovens untended. As the bell continued to toll, the crowd began to realize the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a protest against a tea tax or a stamp act anymore. This was a total severance. The bell was calling them to witness the birth of a nation, but it was also calling them to a war that many knew would be long and bloody. By late afternoon, the city was a cauldron of emotion. The local militia began to gather, their mismatched uniforms and rusted muskets, a stark contrast to the disciplined redcoats they would soon face. But there was a fire in their eyes that no professional army could easily extinguish. The bell had acted as a catalyst, turning a political debate into a popular crusade. As evening fell, the celebrations turned toward the symbols of the old regime. A group of rowdy patriots marched to the local courthouse and tore down the king's coat of arms. They dragged it through the dirt and tossed it into a massive bonfire in the center of the square. The flames leapt high, casting dancing shadows against the brick walls of the State House. While the crowds cheered, the men inside the hall were already facing the grim reality of their decision. They knew that the British fleet under Admiral Howe was already massing near New York. They knew that the Declaration was essentially a suicide note if they lost. "We must indeed all hang together," Franklin famously remarked to the room, his voice dry and steady, "or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The bell ringer finally let go of the rope, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands blistered and raw. The bell slowed, its vibrations humming in the wood of the tower for minutes after the last strike. The silence that followed was not the tense silence of the morning, but a heavy, pregnant silence. The day liberty rang was ending, but the long, dark night of the Revolution was just beginning. Away from the cheering crowds, in the dark corners of the city, loyalists, those still faithful to the king, watched from behind shuttered windows. To them, the sound of the bell was the sound of treason and the herald of certain doom. They knew that families would be split, neighbors would turn against neighbors, and the streets of this fair city might soon run red with the blood of its own citizens. The sound of that bell had traveled farther than just the city limits. Riders were already mounting horses, copies of the Declaration tucked into their saddlebags, ready to ride through the night to New York, to Boston, and to the southern colonies. The iron voice of Philadelphia was being carried by hoofbeat across the continent. The world had been tilted on its axis. A group of colonies had dared to tell the greatest empire on the earth to leave. and as the embers of the bonfires died down, the residents of Philadelphia looked up at the darkened steeple. The bell was silent now, but its message was etched into the very soul of the people. The fight was no longer about words on parchment. It was about the air they breathed and the ground they stood upon.
The echoes of July had faded into the grim, biting reality of 1777. The euphoria of the Declaration had been replaced by the rhythmic thud of marching boots. But they weren't American boots. The British lion, provoked and bleeding, was now roaring toward Philadelphia. General William Howe's massive force was closing in, and the city that had birthed the revolution was about to become a cage. In the late summer heat, the mood in Philadelphia turned from defiance to desperation. The Continental Army under George Washington had suffered a brutal defeat at the Battle of Brandywine. The road to the capital was open. Panic began to ripple through the cobblestone streets. Thousands of patriots packed their lives into wagons, fleeing into the countryside, fearing the noose that awaited any who had cheered for the traitorous bell a year prior. But amidst the chaos, a secret and urgent mission was being plotted in the shadows of the State House. The Continental Congress realized something terrifying. The Liberty Bell was in mortal danger. To the British, the bell was more than a symbol of rebellion. It was over 2,000 pounds of high-quality bronze. In the 18th century, bronze was the currency of war. If the British captured the city, they would melt the bell down and turn it into cannonballs. The very metal that had proclaimed liberty would be fired back into the chests of American soldiers. The bell must be moved, came the order from the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. But how? Moving a ton of vibrating metal quietly while an invading army was only miles away was an impossible task. On the night of September 16, 1777, as the sky wept with a cold, driving rain, a man named John Mickley and his team of teamsters arrived at the State House. They were not soldiers. They were Pennsylvania German farmers, men who knew the land and how to handle heavy loads. With them was a heavy-duty wagon, its wooden axles reinforced for the journey of a lifetime. Working by the dim light of lanterns shielded by burlap, they began the grueling process. Using thick hemp ropes and massive wooden pulleys, they lowered the bell from its tower. Every creak of the wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. Every time the bronze scraped against the stone, the men held their breath, terrified a loyalist spy would hear and alert the British dragoons. Finally, the bell was lowered onto the wagon. To hide its unmistakable shape, they piled mounds of hay, potato sacks, and old manure over it. To any passing British scout, it would look like just another farmer's wagon fleeing the war zone. This was the great escape of the American Revolution's most sacred icon. The journey was a descent into hell. The convoy consisted of over 700 wagons, carrying not just the bell, but the city's bells from Christ Church and St. Peter's, along with military stores. The roads were nothing more than rutted trails of deep, sucking mud. Horses strained until their hearts burst. Wheels snapped in the middle of dark forests. John Mickley's wagon led the way, pushing toward the town of Bethlehem, and then, finally, to Allentown. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main pikes where British cavalry roamed. At one point, near Bethlehem, the unthinkable happened. The heavy wagon carrying the Liberty Bell collapsed. The axle snapped under the sheer weight of the bronze. In the freezing mud, in the middle of the night, with the British Army literally hours behind them, the men had to scramble. They couldn't leave it. If they left it, the revolution's voice would be silenced forever. Working with feverish intensity, they transferred the bell to another wagon belonging to Frederick Leeser. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of men and the distant low rumble of British artillery in the distance. They finally reached the Zion Reformed Church in Allentown. Under the floorboards of the church, in a damp, dark pit, they hid the bell. It was a grave for the voice of America, a place where it would stay in silent exile while the British occupied Philadelphia, turning the State House into a prison and a stable. For nearly a year, the bell sat in the dark. Above it, the congregation sang hymns of hope, while outside, the British searched for the rebel bell, furious that they had been outsmarted by a group of farmers. But back in Philadelphia, the winter of 1777 to 1778 was the darkest hour. While the bell was safe in its hole, Washington's army was starving and freezing at Valley Forge. The British officers were throwing lavish balls in the homes of the patriots who had fled. They mocked the Declaration. They mocked the liberty that had been wrung out just a year before. They thought the revolution was dead. But they were wrong. The bell wasn't dead. It was waiting. It was a secret kept by an entire community. Not a single person in Allentown betrayed its location. That silence was as powerful as the ringing had been. It showed that the spirit of '76 wasn't just in the leaders or the documents. It was buried deep in the earth, in the hearts of common people who refused to let their symbol be destroyed. The occupation eventually broke. The British, realizing they couldn't hold the city with the French entering the war, retreated in June 1778. And like a ghost returning from the afterlife, the bell was unearthed. It was brought back to Philadelphia, its bronze scarred, but its spirit intact. When it returned to the State House, it was more than just a bell. It had survived a hunt. It had been a refugee. It had shared the same mud and fear as the soldiers at Valley Forge. When it finally hung again in its tower, it represented something new: resilience. It proved that you could occupy a city, you could burn the houses, but you could not melt down the will of a people determined to be free. The war had ended, and the smoke of the revolution had cleared, leaving behind a young, fragile nation struggling to find its footing. The bell had returned to its home in the Philadelphia State House, now renamed Independence Hall. But it was no longer just a piece of municipal property. It had become a veteran of the conflict, a silent survivor of the mud and the dark of the Allentown church basement. For decades, it continued to ring for the passage of time, for the deaths of founding fathers like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, and for the annual celebrations of the 4th of July. But as the 19th century dawned, a new and terrible tension began to grip the United States. The promise of liberty that the bell had proclaimed in 1776 was increasingly seen as a half-truth. While the bell's inscription commanded to proclaim liberty through all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof, millions of people remained in the chains of chattel slavery. The bell was about to undergo a transformation, from a symbol of national independence to a piercing cry for human rights. It was during this era, around the 30s and 40s, that the bell earned its most famous name, the Liberty Bell. Before this, it was simply the State House bell. It was the abolitionist movement, those brave souls fighting to end slavery, who adopted the bell as their icon. They looked at the inscription from Leviticus and realized it was a divine mandate. They used images of the bell in their pamphlets and newspapers, pointing out the hypocrisy of a nation that rang a bell of freedom while the whip cracked on the backs of the enslaved. Then came the mystery that has baffled historians for generations: the crack. How does a massive 2,000-pound instrument of bronze simply break? There are many legends, but the most poetic and the most likely is that the bell began to grow weary. For nearly 80 years, it had been struck for every fire, every funeral, and every victory. Bronze is a living metal.
It expands and contracts with the seasons, and every strike of the clapper creates microscopic stress. The first thin hairline fracture likely appeared in the early 1830s. Some say it cracked during the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall in 1835, a somber tolling that signaled the passing of the last of the Revolutionary generation. Others say it happened during a celebration of Washington's birthday. But the fatal blow came in February 1846. The city wanted to honor Washington's birthday with a grand ringing. The ringing team noticed the small crack, and in an attempt to fix it, they widened the groove to prevent the two sides of the metal from vibrating against each other, a process called stop drilling. They rang it one last time. For hours, the bell sang its deep, mournful song across Philadelphia. But the stress was too much. With a violent metallic snap that echoed through the belfry, a second crack snaked upward from the top of the repaired silver, reaching toward the very word liberty in its inscription. The bell went dull. The resonance died. The voice of the revolution had finally broken.
Tragedy. It was seen as a sign of a failing union. By the 1850s, the United States was tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. The North and South were locked in a Cold War that was rapidly turning hot. The crack in the bell became a physical manifestation of the crack in the nation. However, something miraculous happened. The fact that the bell was broken made the American people love it even more. It was no longer a perfect, distant object of British manufacture. It was flawed. It was scarred. It was like the country itself, imperfect, struggling, and battle-worn. The crack didn't represent failure. It represented the ongoing struggle to fulfill the promise of its inscription. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, the Liberty Bell became a rallying cry for the North. Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the greatest orator of freedom, visited Independence Hall. He stood in the shadow of the silent bell and spoke of the Declaration of Independence as the sheet anchor of American liberty. He knew that the war wasn't just about preserving a map, it was about fixing the crack in the American soul. As the war raged, the bell sat in the hallway of Independence Hall, guarded by soldiers. It didn't need to ring anymore. Its silence was louder than any peal. It reminded the Union soldiers what they were fighting for, a world where all the inhabitants truly meant everyone. After the war, with the country bloodied but reunited and slavery finally abolished, the Liberty Bell began its most remarkable journey. It became a traveling ambassador. In the late 1800s, it was placed on special railroad cars and sent across the country, to New Orleans, to Chicago, to San Francisco. Thousands of people who would never see Philadelphia lined the tracks just to catch a glimpse of the bronze giant. Old Civil War veterans from both the North and the South would come to the train, place their hands on the cold, cracked metal, and weep. The bell had done the impossible. It had survived the king. It had survived the fire of war, and it had survived its own breaking. It had become the silent orator. It told the world that liberty is not something you inherit and keep in a box. It is something that is fragile, something that can crack, and something that must be protected with every generation. By the turn of the 20th century, the Liberty Bell was the most famous object in America. It had become a pilgrimage site for suffragettes fighting for the right to vote, and for civil rights leaders who saw in its crack the unfinished business of democracy. The day liberty rang the bell in 1776 was just the beginning. The bell's true story was in its endurance, the way it stood its ground while the world changed around it. Even today, as it sits in its glass pavilion in Philadelphia, millions of people from every corner of the globe come to look at it. They don't see a broken piece of junk. They see a mirror. They see a symbol that says, "We are not perfect, but we are still here. We are cracked, but we are still beautiful. And we are still striving to ring for everyone." The Liberty Bell no longer swings. Its iron tongue has been stilled for over a century and a half, held in place by a mechanical spider of steel to prevent the bronze from succumbing to the relentless pull of gravity. Yet to look upon it in its modern sanctuary in Philadelphia is to realize that a bell does not need to move to make a sound. The day Liberty rang was not a single calendar date in 1776. It was the ignition of a signal fire that has jumped from continent to continent, century to century, refusing to be extinguished. As the 20th century dawned, the bell transitioned from a national relic to a global icon of human dignity. During the dark days of World War I and World War II, the image of the cracked bell was plastered on posters across the United States. It was the face of the Liberty Loans, asking citizens to fund the fight against tyranny in Europe. It became a symbol of the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. American soldiers carried small tokens of the bell in their pockets as they stormed the beaches of Normandy, a reminder that they were the descendants of the men who had hidden that same bell in a damp church floor to keep it from the hands of an oppressor. But perhaps the most profound ringing of the bell occurred during the 1960s, a time of deep social upheaval. Civil rights leaders, led by the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., invoked the bell's inscription with a new, urgent fire. When Dr. King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and cried out, "Let freedom ring," he was not just using a metaphor, he was reaching back through time to that hot July day in Philadelphia. He was calling upon the silent orator to finally fulfill the promise made in 1776, the promise that liberty was for all the inhabitants of the land, regardless of the color of their skin. The crack in the bell, once seen as a flaw, became a source of immense comfort for the marginalized. It whispered a truth that every oppressed person understands, that something can be broken and yet remain sacred, that a nation can have a scarred history and still be capable of greatness. The bell became a pilgrimage site for world leaders, from Nelson Mandela to the Dalai Lama, each of them standing before the bronze giant and recognizing the universal human ache for self-determination. In the modern era, the bell has moved to a grand glass-walled pavilion. It sits in a direct line of sight with Independence Hall, the place where its journey began. On every 4th of July, a tradition takes place that sends chills down the spines of those who witness it. Descendants of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence gather around the bell. They do not swing it, the metal is too fragile for that, but they tap it gently with a small mallet. Tap, tap, tap. The sound is faint, a ghost of the roar that once shook the city, but it is enough. In those 3 small strikes, the bridge between the past and the present is rebuilt. It is a reminder that the experiment of democracy is still ongoing. The bell is not a monument to a finished task. It is a monument to a work in progress. Think of the journey this metal has taken. It was born in a London foundry, the product of the very empire it would eventually defy. It was nearly melted into weapons of war. It was dragged through the mud by farmers. It was hidden in the dark. It traveled thousands of miles on the backs of steam engines. It cracked under the weight of its own message, and through it all, it remained. The story of the day Liberty rang is ultimately your story. It is the story of anyone who has ever stood up against an unfair power. It is the story of anyone who has been told they are broken and yet chose to stand tall. The Liberty Bell teaches us that freedom is not a gift that is handed down. It is a heavy bronze responsibility that must be carried, protected, and sometimes hidden in the dark until it is safe to bring it back into the light. As the sun sets over Philadelphia today, the shadow of the bell stretches long across the grass of the National Mall. It points toward the future. The message inscribed in its grain, "Proclaim liberty," is an active verb. It is a command. It is a call to action for every person who hears its story to ensure that the crack in our world, the gaps in justice, the failures of equality, is eventually mended by our collective will. The bell is silent, yes, but if you listen closely in the quiet moments of history, you can still hear the vibration. It rings in the hearts of those who seek the truth. It rings in the voices of those who speak for the voiceless. It rings whenever a person decides that they will no longer live in the shadow of a crown. The day liberty rang the bell was only the beginning. The resonance continues. It is up to us to make sure the song never ends. While the physical bell remains stationary in its climate-controlled sanctuary, the story of its preservation and the people who dedicated their lives to its survival is a saga of its own, a testament to the fact that symbols only live as long as there are people willing to bleed for them. This is the story of the unseen guardians, the generations of Americans who treated this piece of bronze not as metal, but as the very heart of the Republic. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the bell became a target. During times of civil unrest and international conflict, there were those who wished to destroy it, seeing it as a symbol of a system they despised, and those who wished to steal it, seeing it as the ultimate prize. During the height of the Cold War, security around the bell reached a fever pitch. It was no longer just guarded by a simple wooden railing. It was protected by the most sophisticated security measures the United States could devise. Sensors were placed beneath its floor, and glass that could withstand a direct blast was installed. But the real protection came from the curators and historians who treated the bell like a fragile elderly patient. By the 1970s, scientists were brought in to perform a medical examination on the bronze giant. Using X-ray technology and acoustic tests, they looked deep into the heart of the metal. In ways the Founding Fathers could never have imagined. After World War II, as part of the Freedom Bell initiative, a replica of the Liberty Bell was cast and sent to West Berlin. It was a gift from the American people to the people of Germany, who were then living in the shadow of the Iron Curtain. When that replica rang out in Berlin, it wasn't just ringing for American independence. It was ringing for the hope that one day the walls of tyranny everywhere would crumble. The Liberty Bell had become a template for freedom for the entire world. But perhaps the most intimate stories of the bell come from the millions of ordinary visitors who stand before it every year. There are stories of refugees from war-torn nations who, upon reaching Philadelphia, go straight to the bell and burst into tears. To them, the crack in the bell represents their own broken lives, and the fact that the bell is still standing gives them the courage to believe that they too can rebuild. There are stories of children who reach out to touch the glass, asking their parents if the bell will ever wake up and ring again. The truth is, the bell is never asleep. Every time a new law is passed that expands human rights, the bell rings. Every time a person stands up to a bully, the bell rings. Every time a nation chooses democracy over dictatorship, the bell rings. Its physical silence is a choice to let the people be the ones to make the noise. As we look toward the 250th anniversary of the Declaration and beyond, the Liberty Bell stands as a silent sentinel. It has seen the rise and fall of empires, the invention of the light bulb and the internet, and the slow, painful progress of human equality. It reminds us that liberty is not a destination, but a journey. It is a fragile thing, easily cracked, but incredibly difficult to destroy. To truly understand the epic of the Liberty Bell, we must travel back before the Revolution, back to its very creation. Many see the bell as a divine object that fell from the sky, but its origins were plagued by failure, embarrassment, and human error. This is the story of how a mistake became the most holy relic of a superpower. In 1751, the Pennsylvania Assembly ordered a bell for the State House. They didn't want just any bell, they wanted a masterpiece. They sent their request to London, to the prestigious Whitechapel Bell Foundry. The requirements were strict. The metal had to be of the highest quality, and the inscription from Leviticus had to be perfect. The British craftsmen, the best in the world, cast the bell with precision and shipped it across the Atlantic. When the bell arrived in Philadelphia in 1752, the city was electric with anticipation. A massive wooden frame was built to test it. The crowd gathered, the dignitaries straightened their coats, and the bell ringer pulled the rope for the very first time. But there was no majestic roar. Instead, at the very first strike of the clapper, the brand new bell cracked. The sound was a dull, sickening thud. The pride of Philadelphia had shattered before it had even begun its life. It was a humiliation. The people of the colonies, already feeling like second-class citizens to the British, saw this as a metaphor for their own perceived inferiority. The authorities were desperate. They couldn't wait another year for a new bell to be shipped from London. Two local metal workers, John Pass and John Stowe, stepped forward. They were not master bell makers. They were founders who dealt with pots, pans, and cannons. They took the broken British bell, smashed it into small pieces with sledgehammers, and melted it in a roaring furnace. Pass and Stowe thought they knew better than the British. They added more copper to the mix to make the metal less brittle. They worked through the night, the orange glow of the molten bronze reflecting in their sweat-streaked faces. They recast the bell and hung it again. But when they rang it this time, the sound was horrific. One witness described it as sounding like two coal scuttles being banged together. The crowd laughed. Pass and Stowe were mocked in the streets. Ashamed, they took the bell down again. They melted it a second time, adjusting the chemical balance of the tin and copper. On their third attempt, the bell finally produced a clear, ringing tone. It wasn't perfect. It lacked the silver clarity of the great European bells, but it was theirs. It was an American bell, made from the remains of a British failure. This alchemy of failure is the hidden soul of the Liberty Bell. It was forged in frustration, recast in defiance, and born from the hands of common laborers who refused to give up. As the decades passed, the history of the bell became intertwined with myth. One of the most famous stories, one told to millions of American schoolchildren, is that of the old bell ringer and his grandson. The legend says that on July 4, 1776, the old man sat despondently in the steeple, fearing the declaration would never be signed. Suddenly, his grandson appeared below, shouting, "Ring, grandfather, ring for liberty!" While this story is likely a fictionalized account written years later by a journalist named George Lippard, its popularity reveals a deeper truth. The American people needed the bell to be a hero. They needed to believe that the metal itself was conscious of the history it was witnessing. The myth became more important than the dry historical record because the myth gave the people a sense of destiny. Even the crack itself has its own mythology. Some legends claim that the bell cracked because it was too loud for tyranny to handle, or that it broke at the exact moment the last founding father died, as if the bell were exhaling its final breath alongside the men who gave it purpose. But beyond the myths lies a dark, secret history of the bell's physical survival. In the 19th century, the bell was treated with shocking negligence. At one point, it was nearly sold as scrap metal for $56. An eagle-eyed citizen saved it from being melted down to make steam engine parts. Later, it was used as a literal lost and found bin, where people would drop trash or letters into its hollow interior. It wasn't until the 1840s, when the abolitionists adopted it, that the bell was sanctified. They saw the crack not as a defect, but as a wound. They saw the bell as a martyr. This shift in perception is one of the most important chapters in the story. It teaches us that a symbol is not defined by its physical condition, but by the weight of the dreams we project onto it. In the late 1800s, during its famous railroad tours, the bell became a tool of reconciliation. After the horrific bloodshed of the American Civil War, the nation was a jagged mess of resentment. When the Liberty Bell traveled through the southern states, the very states that had tried to secede, something miraculous happened. Former Confederate soldiers, men who had fought against the Union, stood in line to kiss the bell.
They didn't see it as a Yankee trophy. They saw it as a symbol of a shared heritage that predated their conflict. The bell, in its cracked and silent state, did more to heal the wounds of the Civil War than 1,000 political speeches ever could. The Liberty Bell has lived 1,000 lives. It has been a British reject, an American experiment, a forgotten piece of junk, a weapon of propaganda, a bridge for peace. It has been cursed, mocked, hidden, worshipped, and guarded by soldiers. As it sits today, cold and still, it carries the molecular memory of all those moments. Every person who has touched it, every hand that has rubbed its side for good luck, has left a microscopic trace of themselves on the bronze. The bell is no longer just metal. It is a physical manifestation of the American journey, a journey that is loud, messy, broken, and yet, somehow, undeniably resonant. Millennium. Many wondered if an ancient, cracked hunk of bronze could still hold relevance in a world defined by fiber optics, satellite communication, and artificial intelligence. The 21st century brought with it a level of noise, both literal and digital, that threatened to drown out the low, resonant history of the 18th century. Yet the Liberty Bell did not fade into the background. Instead, it underwent its most complex transformation yet. It became a digital beacon, a meme of freedom, and a silent participant in the modern information war. In the early 2000s, the National Park Service realized that the bell's physical safety was no longer the only concern. The bell had become a target for a different kind of threat. In a world of globalized ideologies, symbols are the primary currency of power. On April 6, 2001, a man rushed past the security barriers at the Liberty Bell Center. In a moment of inexplicable rage or madness, he swung a heavy hammer at the bell. The sound of the hammer striking the ancient bronze sent a shiver through the city of Philadelphia. It wasn't the deep musical note of the 1700s. It was the harsh, metallic clang of an assault. The man struck the bell multiple times, leaving small indentations on its side. The world watched in horror as the news spread across the internet. But when the dust settled, the experts found something remarkable. The bell, despite its age and its famous crack, had held firm. It had taken the blows and remained standing. This incident served as a stark reminder that freedom is always under threat, often from within, and that the symbols we hold dear require constant, vigilant protection. This attack led to the most technologically advanced preservation effort in human history. The bell was moved into its current high-tech pavilion, a structure designed with the precision of a laboratory and the reverence of a cathedral. Engineers installed sensors that monitor the air quality down to the microscopic level, ensuring that the acidic breath of millions of tourists doesn't corrode the precious patina of the bronze. Lasers now scan the crack every second, looking for shifts as small as a human hair. The Liberty Bell is now arguably the most monitored object on the planet. But while the physical bell was being encased in glass and steel, its digital ghost began to travel further than the physical bell ever could. In the age of social media, the image of the cracked bell became a universal symbol for truth-telling. When activists in distant countries, nations where speaking against the government can lead to disappearance, post images of the Liberty Bell, they are tapping into the signal that was first sent out in 1776. They don't need to hear the bell ring. They understand what the crack stands for. It stands for the idea that a system can be broken and still be worth fighting for. It stands for the fact that the voice of the people is louder than the metal that tries to contain it. In the United States, the bell has found a new home in the world of digital democracy. It is no longer just a relic in a museum. It is a reference point for every debate about the future of the nation. When people discuss the cracks in the modern justice system or the faint ringing of equality, they are using the language of the bell. It has become part of the American DNA,
an internal compass that tells us when we are drifting too far from the promises of the belfry. There is a secret irony in the bell's current state. It is a communication tool that can no longer communicate in the way it was designed. It cannot ring. If you were to strike it today, the sound would be dead, a dull thwack instead of a resonant peal. And yet it has never been more articulate. Its silence is a profound statement. It tells us that the era of being told what to do by a loud, ringing authority is over. We are now in the era where we must find the resonance within ourselves. The bell also serves a warning about the fragility of the republic. Just as the bell was cast, recast, and then eventually broke under the strain of its own duty, a nation can also break if it is struck too hard or too often by division. The bell sits in Philadelphia as a memento mori, a reminder that all things, even the most powerful symbols of liberty, are subject to the laws of decay if they are not cared for. As the sun sets over the Delaware River and the lights of the pavilion turn on, casting a golden glow over the bronze, one can't help but feel that the bell is waiting. It is waiting for the next great challenge to the human spirit. It is waiting to see if the generation of today has the same founding fire as the farmers who dragged it through the mud of 1777. The day liberty rang is no longer a historical event found in a textbook. It is a recurring frequency. Every time a citizen casts a vote, every time a journalist tells a difficult truth, every time a person stands up for a neighbor, the bell rings in the digital ether. Its sound has become a frequency that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the soul. The story of the Liberty Bell is the story of humanity's long, messy, and beautiful struggle to be heard. It is the story that started in a London fire, was forged in a Philadelphia furnace, was hidden in a basement, and now lives in a cloud of data and memory. It is the unbroken signal. It is the bell that refuses to be silenced, even by its own brokenness. As we reach the final movement of this grand metallic symphony, we must ask the question that haunts every historian and every tourist who gazes through the glass in Philadelphia. Why this object? Why does a defective, silent, and ancient piece of English bronze hold a power over the human imagination that even the most modern monuments cannot replicate? The answer lies not in the metal itself, but in the eternal echo. The realization that the Liberty Bell is not a monument to a moment that passed, but a living entity that evolves with every heart that beats for freedom. To understand the finality of its message, we must look at the bell as a mirror of the human condition. Every person who has ever lived has felt cracked. We have all felt the weight of expectations that we could not meet, the pressure of a world that tries to mold us into something we are not, and the internal fractures caused by our own mistakes. When we look at the Liberty Bell, we don't see a perfect God. We see ourselves. We see an object that failed twice, was melted down, was ridiculed, was almost sold for scrap, and eventually broke. And yet it is the most honored object in the most powerful nation on earth. Its greatness comes from its survival, not its perfection. In this final chapter of its history, the bell has become a global pulse. Even in the 2020s, in an era of polarized politics and global uncertainty, the bell remains the one thing everyone can agree upon. It has transcended the politics of the 18th century. It no longer belongs to the Continental Congress or the Pennsylvania Assembly. It belongs to the person in a crowded city halfway across the world who is typing a message of protest on a cracked smartphone screen. It belongs to the student who refuses to be silenced by a curriculum of lies. It belongs to the prisoner of conscience who hums a song of freedom in a dark cell. The day liberty rang was the spark, but the resonance is the heat that keeps the world warm. If the bell were to be perfectly repaired today, if the best scientists in the world used laser welding and advanced metallurgy to close the gap and make it ring with a perfect silver tone, it would lose its power. Its voice would become just another sound. The crack is its mouth. The crack is where the spirit of the people lives. It is the open wound of democracy that reminds us that our work is never, ever finished. There is a secret irony in the bell's current state. It is a communication tool that can no longer communicate in the way it was designed. It cannot ring. If you were to strike it today, the sound would be dead, a dull thwack instead of a resonant peal. And yet it has never been more articulate. Its silence is a profound statement. It tells us that the era of being told what to do by a loud, ringing authority is over. We are now in the era where we must find the resonance within ourselves. The bell also serves a warning about the fragility of the republic. Just as the bell was cast, recast, and then eventually broke under the strain of its own duty, a nation can also break if it is struck too hard or too often by division. The bell sits in Philadelphia as a memento mori, a reminder that all things, even the most powerful symbols of liberty, are subject to the laws of decay if they are not cared for. As the sun sets over the Delaware River and the lights of the pavilion turn on, casting a golden glow over the bronze, one can't help but feel that the bell is waiting. It is waiting for the next great challenge to the human spirit. It is waiting to see if the generation of today has the same founding fire as the farmers who dragged it through the mud of 1777. The day liberty rang is no longer a historical event found in a textbook. It is a recurring frequency. Every time a citizen casts a vote, every time a journalist tells a difficult truth, every time a person stands up for a neighbor, the bell rings in the digital ether. Its sound
with a message of radical hope. In a world that often feels like it is shattering, where social fabrics are caring and the cracks in our global community seem too wide to bridge, the bell stands as proof that breaking is not the end. The bell was most useful after it cracked. It became a symbol after it was silenced. It moved the world after it was forced to stay still. As the final light of this narrative fades, imagine the old bell ringer from Chapter 1. Imagine him looking forward through time, past the wars, past the steam engines, past the internet, and seeing you. He would tell you that the rope is now in your hands. The bell doesn't need to be in a tower to ring. It rings every time you choose courage over fear. It rings every time you stand up for someone who has been silenced. It rings every time you refuse to let the crack in your own life stop you from making a beautiful sound. The Liberty Bell is not a relic of the past. It is a prophecy of the future. It tells us that as long as there is one person left who dreams of being free, the bell is still ringing. It tells us that though the metal may be cold, the fire that forged it still burns in the soul of humanity. The day liberty rang the bell was just the beginning of a sound that will roll on, across oceans and through centuries, until every inhabitant of the earth can finally walk in the light of its echo. This is the story of the bell. It is a story of fire, failure, mud, and miracles. It is a story of a silent giant that speaks louder than 1,000 cannons. And as long as its image remains, as long as its crack is visible to the eyes of the world, the promise of 1776 remains alive. The bell is silent, but the world is listening. To understand the full magnitude of the Liberty Bell, one must venture beyond the history books and into the realm of the physical and the metaphysical. While the previous chapters have told the story of men, wars, and documents, this chapter explores the very soul of the bronze itself, the science of its silence, and the strange, almost supernatural way it continues to influence the world. This is the story of the bell's ghost note, the vibration that exists even when there is no strike. The composition of the Liberty Bell is a unique, accidental recipe. When Pass and Stowe recast the bell in 1753, they weren't just melting metal, they were performing a desperate kind of frontier chemistry. The bell is composed of approximately 70% copper, 25% tin, and trace amounts of lead, zinc, gold, and silver. It is this specific, imperfect blend that gives the bell its distinctive dull gold patina. But more importantly, this mixture created a specific internal friction within the metal. Scientists who have studied the bell using ultrasonic testing have discovered that the bell possesses a memory. Every time it was rung between 1753 and 1846, the metal molecules were pushed to their absolute limit. The crack we see today isn't just a break in the surface, it is the result of nearly a century of the metal screaming under the tension of its duty. When the bell finally fractured, it wasn't a failure of craftsmanship, it was a release of energy. There is a phenomenon in acoustics known as sympathetic resonance. If you have two pianos in a room and you strike a note on one, the corresponding string on the second piano will begin to vibrate, even if no one touches it. The Liberty Bell operates on a global scale of sympathetic resonance. It has become the primary string of freedom. When a bell rings in a small village in Ukraine, or a cathedral in South America, or a schoolhouse in rural India, it is, in a sense, vibrating in sympathy with the silent giant in Philadelphia. The Liberty Bell provides the pitch for the world's desire for self-determination. In the late 19th century, a team of acoustic engineers from Pennsylvania State University attempted to do the impossible. They wanted to hear what the bell sounded like before it cracked. Using advanced computer modeling and the physical dimensions of the bell, they reconstructed its digital voice. They factored in the thickness of the bronze, the curve of the waist, and the weight of the clapper. The result was a sound that was described as hauntingly deep and complex. Unlike modern bells that have a single clear strike note, the Liberty Bell had a discordant, multi-layered tone. It didn't just ring, it wavered. It had a hum that lasted for nearly a minute after being struck. This complexity, this lack of a perfect note, is perhaps why it resonates so deeply with the human spirit. It's a messy, complicated sound for a messy, complicated democracy. But the bell's influence extends even into the stars. In the 1960s, during the height of the space race, the Liberty Bell 7 spacecraft was launched as part of the Mercury program. Named after the icon in Philadelphia, the capsule even had a crack painted on its side. When the capsule was lost at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean after splashdown, it was seen as a national tragedy. When it was finally recovered decades later, it was treated with the same reverence as the bell itself. It showed that the symbol of the bell had transcended the earth. It was now a symbol for humanity's reach towards the infinite. This leads us to the concept of the silent bell as a guardian of truth. In an age of deepfakes and digital manipulation, the physical reality of the Liberty Bell becomes more important every day. You cannot fake 2,000 pounds of 18th century bronze. It is a zero point of history. It stands as a physical anchor in a world that is becoming increasingly untethered from reality. When you stand in front of it, you aren't looking at a screen or a projection. You are looking at the very same atoms that felt the heat of the 1776 sun. That physical continuity is a powerful antidote to the transience of the modern world. The bell also serves as a teacher of patience. In our world of instant gratification, where we expect problems to be solved with a click, the bell stands as a reminder that the proclamation of liberty is a slow, multi-generational process. The bell took 90 years to crack, and it has been sitting in its silent, cracked state for nearly 180 years. It teaches us that the long arc of history does not bend towards justice on its own. It requires the steady, heavy weight of people who are willing to wait, to protect, and to endure.
As we conclude this chapter, imagine the molecules of the bell right now. Even as you read these words, the atoms in that bronze are vibrating. They are affected by the temperature of the room, the sound of the city outside, and the very gravity of the earth. The bell is not dead metal. It is a living, breathing witness. It is the ghost note of the American experiment, the sound you hear when everything else goes quiet, and you ask yourself what it truly means to be free. The day liberty rang the bell was a moment in time, but the resonance of that ringing is a law of nature. It is as inescapable as light and as persistent as time. It is the heart that refuses to stop beating, even when it is broken. To look at the Liberty Bell is to see a relic of political history, but beneath the surface of the official narrative lies a darker, more mysterious thread of stories that have been whispered in the corridors of Independence Hall for centuries. These are the tales of the Iron Curse, the strange, almost supernatural coincidences that suggest the bell is not just a passive object, but a sentinel that reacts to the moral temperature of the nation. For those who spent their lives guarding the bell, it was common knowledge that the bronze seemed to possess a weight that wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. One of the chilling legends involves the curse of the king's metal. As mentioned in earlier chapters, the original bell was cast in London at the Whitechapel Foundry. When it arrived in Philadelphia and immediately shattered, local occultists and superstitious citizens didn't see it as a mechanical failure. They saw it as a spiritual rejection. The English earth of the bell, they claimed, could not survive in the air of liberty. Every time the bell was recast, the spirit of the metal seemed to fight against its new form. It was as if the British bronze was cursed to never be whole again once it touched American soil. A permanent fracture representing a permanent divorce between the old world and the new. Then there is the legend of the death toll. For decades, the bell was rung to announce the passing of America's greatest figures, but a pattern began to emerge that terrified the bell ringers of the 19th century. It was said that the bell didn't just honor the dead, it predicted their departure.
Began to toll for the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall. Many reported that the sound didn't carry its usual resonance. It sounded like a moan, a long, agonizing cry that chilled the bones of those standing in the square. It was during this very session that the Great Crack, the one we see today, supposedly began its final, fatal climb. To the people of that era, the bell was dying alongside the last guardians of the original revolutionary spirit. The bell wasn't just breaking, it was breaking its heart because it knew a darker era of American history was coming, the era of the Civil War. Throughout the 1850s, as the nation spiraled toward fratricide, the silent bell was said to behave strangely. Guards reported hearing the bell hum in the middle of the night when no one was near it. A low, vibrating thrum would fill the empty halls of Independence Hall, a sound like a distant, approaching storm. Some claimed that if you stood near the bell in total darkness, you could hear the muffled sounds of a battlefield, the clashing of sabers and the screams of horses emanating from the hollow interior of the bronze. It was as if the bell were acting as a psychic sponge, absorbing the mounting tension and hatred of a divided people. Even more mysterious is the ghost of the steeple. For years, visitors have reported seeing a figure in 18th century clothing standing near the bell in the late hours of the night. This isn't the ghost of a famous general or a president, but the spirit of a simple workman, perhaps John Pass or John Stowe, forever trying to fix the flaw in the metal. The figure is said to be seen touching the crack with a look of immense sorrow, as if trying to pull the two sides of the bronze back together with ghostly hands. This eternal repairman represents the American struggle to mend what is broken, a task that is never-ending.
There are also stories from the bell's exile in 1777. During the journey to Allentown, the farmers who transported the bell reported that their horses seemed to be led by an unseen force. On the nights when the convoy was in danger of being discovered by British scouts, a heavy, unnatural mist would descend over the wagons, hiding them from view. One teamster claimed that in the middle of a particularly treacherous creek crossing, when the wagon was sinking into the mud and all seemed lost, the bell itself began to glow with a faint blue light, the St. Elmo's fire of the forest, and the wagon suddenly became as light as air, pulling itself out of the muck. But perhaps the most profound supernatural aspect of the bell is the curse of the touch. For a century, it was a tradition for visitors to touch the bell for luck or to connect with history. However, some have reported a phenomenon called the weight. When they placed their hand on the cold bronze, they didn't feel a sense of luck. They felt an overwhelming rush of human emotion, a crushing wave of the combined hopes, fears, and agonies of every person who had ever looked to the bell for salvation. It was so intense that some people fainted or were moved to uncontrollable tears. The bell, through its atoms, had become a hard drive for the American experience, storing the vibrations of millions of lives. In the modern era, even with the high-tech sensors and the bulletproof glass, the mystery remains. On several occasions, the ultra-sensitive acoustic monitors designed to detect earthquakes or structural shifts have picked up anomalous frequencies coming from the bell, sounds that don't match any known environmental noise. These are referred to by the engineers as the whisper. It is a rhythmic, pulsing sound, almost like a slow, metallic heartbeat. Why does the bell continue to behave this way? Perhaps because it is more than just a symbol. It is a talisman. In ancient cultures, a talisman was an object imbued with the spirit of a tribe. The Liberty Bell is the talisman of the American tribe. It was born in fire, tested in war, scarred by time, and silenced by gravity. It has seen things that no human being could endure. The day Liberty rang the bell was the moment the talisman was activated. Since then, it has acted as a spiritual anchor for the continent. It is said that as long as the Liberty Bell remains in Philadelphia, the voice of the people can never be truly extinguished. But the legend also warns, should the bell ever be completely destroyed, or should it be removed from the land it was meant to protect, the signal will be lost, and the nation will fall into a permanent, icy silence. The bell sits there now, in the dark or in the light, a silent giant with 1,000 secrets. It is a ghost in the machine of the modern world. It is the broken heart that still beats. It is the curse and a blessing of a people who dared to reach for the stars while their feet were still mired in the mud. Beyond the ghosts and the legends lies a layer of history buried beneath the very floorboards of Independence Hall, a narrative of secret societies, hidden geometry, and an international struggle for the power of the symbol. In the mid-18th century, Philadelphia was not just a colonial city, it was a hub for Enlightenment thinkers, Freemasons, and Rosicrucians. To these men, the Liberty Bell was not merely a tool for gathering the public, it was a carefully constructed vibrational key designed to anchor a new world order based on reason rather than royalty. For years, a persistent theory has circulated among architectural historians regarding the specific placement of the bell. The original State House, Independence Hall, was built with a precision that defies the standard colonial construction of the time. Some believe that the building itself was designed as a massive resonator, a stone and wood instrument meant to amplify the frequency of the bell. The bell's placement in the steeple was not accidental. It was positioned at a specific longitudinal coordinate that aligned with the celestial patterns of the summer solstice, the same time of year the Declaration would eventually be signed. The conspiracy of the founders suggests that men like Benjamin Franklin, a master of electricity and a high-ranking Freemason, knew the psychological power of sound. They knew that a specific frequency could induce a state of collective euphoria or shared resolve. When the bell was recast by Pass and Stowe, it is rumored that Franklin himself provided them with a specific alloy, a secret metal added to the furnace, that would ensure the bell's tone could be heard for miles, vibrating not just in the ears, but in the chests of all who heard it. But there was a darker side to this architectural mastery. As the tensions with the British Crown grew, the Hidden Guardians, a secret group within the Continental Congress, began to use the bell as a coded signaling device. It is said that the rhythmic pattern of the tolling was used to transmit messages across the city to revolutionary cells. 3 slow tolls followed by 2 quick ones might mean a British spy was in the tavern. A rhythmic heartbeat tolling might signal that a shipment of gunpowder had arrived safely at the docks. The bell was the Internet of the 1770s, a wireless communication system that the British soldiers, despite their presence in the city, could never quite decode. The most controversial aspect of this chapter involves the missing bronze. Historians have long noted that when Pass and Stowe melted down the original British cast bell, the weight of the new bell didn't perfectly match the original. Where did the extra bronze go? A persistent legend suggests that the missing metal was cast into 12 small, identical handbells. These 12 apostles of liberty were supposedly given to secret agents of the Revolution who carried them to the far reaches of the 13 colonies. It was said that when the Great Bell in Philadelphia rang on July 8, 1776, these 12 smaller bells were rung simultaneously in secret locations from the forests of Maine to the swamps of Georgia. This created a harmonic net over the continent, a symbolic web of sound that tied the colonies together before the first shot of the war was even fired. In the modern era, even with the high-tech sensors and the bulletproof glass, the mystery remains. On several occasions, the ultra-sensitive acoustic monitors designed to detect earthquakes or structural shifts have picked up anomalous frequencies coming from the bell, sounds that don't match any known environmental noise. These are referred to by the engineers as the whisper. It is a rhythmic, pulsing sound, almost like a slow, metallic heartbeat.